Awaken your spirit-chosen ones. Power doesn't panic when it's accused. It panics when it's exposed. For years, the world ran on a comfortable lie that certain levels of wealth came with a kind of moral immunity, like money could buy not just privacy but erasure. Then the Epstein files landed, and suddenly the illusion didn't just crack, it malfunctioned in public. Not because secrets exist, everyone knows they do, but because the pattern became visible, names repeated, connections overlapped, excuses sounded rehearsed, and for the first time, the public wasn't just reacting emotionally, it was observing intelligently. Here's a fact most people miss. After major elite scandals, spending on behavioral science, data analytics, and narrative control quietly spikes among the ultra-wealthy, not security, not lawyers, psychology, because the real damage wasn't legal, it was perceptual. Once people stop seeing power as distant and flawless, they start seeing it as human, flawed, and strategically vulnerable. And that changes everything. What made this moment different wasn't outrage. Outrage burns fast and dies young. What lingered was something far more uncomfortable: awareness. People didn't just feel angry, they became attentive. They started noticing timing, wording, silence, deflection, and emotional manipulation. In other words, the audience leveled up. And nothing terrifies insulated power more than an audience that understands the script. Behind closed doors, this triggered a quiet scramble. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, no shredders flying out windows, but something more subtle and far more serious. Minds were studied, attention spans were measured, emotional reactions were modeled. Because once the public learns how power actually behaves under pressure, influence stops being automatic. It has to be earned, rehearsed, and maintained. And here's the slightly funny part. All that wealth, all that status, all those private jets, and the real threat turned out to be people sitting at home, scrolling calmly, connecting dots, sipping tea like, interesting, no pitchforks, no riots, just pattern recognition. That's not chaos. That's intelligence becoming inconvenient. This isn't a story about scandal. It's a story about a psychological shift that can't be undone. Because once power realizes it's being understood instead of merely feared or admired, the game changes. Quietly. Permanently. Number one, the real shock. Wasn't the crimes, it was the access. What shook people wasn't learning that terrible things happened behind closed doors. Most adults already know that power can rot in private. The real disruption came from seeing who could walk through those doors freely. The access told a louder story than the acts themselves. Politicians, financiers, academics, royalty-adjacent figures, media insiders, not rumors, not shadows, but overlapping circles that were never meant to overlap in public view. That's when discomfort replaced shock, because access isn't accidental. It's granted, protected, and maintained. Access reveals trust. It reveals endorsement. It reveals who feels safe enough to be seen, who assumes consequences won't apply to them, and who believes the system will bend quietly if needed. That realization hit harder than any headline. People understood that this wasn't about one person's depravity. It was about a shared confidence among the powerful that proximity to wrongdoing wouldn't stain them. And that confidence had been correct for a very long time. The unsettling part was how normal it all looked. No secret underground society, no dramatic costumes, just private planes, invitations, introductions, favors, and familiarity. That's what rattled people. Evil didn't look monstrous, it looked organized, social, and well-connected. That recognition forces a harder truth. Systems don't fail accidentally at that level. They fail by design through silence, benefit, and selective blindness. Once people grasped that access is the real currency of power, a mental switch flipped. Wealth stopped being impressive on its own. Titles stopped sounding authoritative. People started asking quieter, sharper questions in their minds, not out loud, but internally. Who protects who? Who gains from not knowing? Who keeps getting invited back? And that awareness doesn't fade easily, because once you see access as the real indicator of power, you stop being distracted by surface morality. You stop assuming distance equals innocence. You realize that the most revealing information isn't what someone says. It's where they're allowed to stand without explanation. That's why this moment lingered. Crimes shock briefly. Access rewires perception. And perception, once changed, doesn't return to its old setting. Number 2, billionaires study psychology more than economics. At the highest level of wealth, money stops being the main obsession. Once you already have more than you could ever spend, the real focus shifts to control, and control lives in the human mind. Economics explains markets, but psychology explains people, and people move markets. That's the quiet realization that changed strategy at the top. After major public exposures and scandals, the ultra-wealthy learned something uncomfortable. You can survive financial loss, but you can't survive a permanent shift in how people perceive you. Stock prices can recover. Public trust is harder to rebuild. Once the crowd sees you differently, everything connected to your name feels different. Your companies, your partnerships, your influence. So the smart ones stopped studying only balance sheets and started studying behavior patterns. They invest in data analysts who track emotional reactions in real time. They hire experts who understand outrage cycles, attention spans, groupthink, and narrative framing. They analyze how fast anger rises, how long it lasts, and what distracts it. This isn't paranoia, it's strategy. Because in the digital age, perception spreads faster than any press release can contain. Economics is predictable compared to human emotion. Markets respond to interest rates and supply chains. People respond to fear, betrayal, loyalty, status, and tribal instincts. When exposure events happen, the real battlefield isn't the courtroom, it's public opinion, and public opinion runs on psychology. The wealthy learned that influence doesn't require controlling everyone. It only requires understanding how groups think under pressure. If you can predict behavior, you can position yourself ahead of it. That's why think tanks, behavioral science firms, and data modeling teams quietly became as important as investment advisors. This shift isn't dramatic or obvious. It doesn't make headlines. But it's real. The new currency isn't just capital. It's cognitive leverage. The ability to anticipate reactions before they happen. The ability to redirect attention without appearing to. And once you understand that the elite are studying how minds move, you start to see why the game feels different. Number 3, secrecy is a currency more valuable than cash. After the Epstein files, the ultra-wealthy learned a lesson that money alone could never teach them. Secrets are worth more than any bank account. Cash can be spent, assets can be lost, and fortunes can vanish overnight. A secret, however, is leverage. It can open doors, close deals, or protect a reputation that would otherwise collapse. In elite circles, knowing something no one else knows is not just power, it's insurance. The files exposed the invisible economy of information. Every detail, every connection, every piece of knowledge about influential people suddenly had a price, but not in dollars. Its value was measured in influence, immunity, and opportunity. People realized that the ability to keep, manage, or even strategically leak secrets became a form of wealth that compounds silently, invisibly, and sometimes indefinitely. Unlike money, which loses value through taxation, inflation, or market collapse, The right secret grows in potency with time. This understanding reshaped how the elite operate. Private jets, luxury homes, and legal teams are no longer the only protective layers. Narrative control and intelligence networks have become essential. It isn't just about covering tracks. It's about anticipating who might notice them, who might exploit them, and how to turn knowledge into advantage before anyone else acts. Secrets are now traded, not openly, but in subtle cues, whispered introductions, and selective transparency. The frightening part is how quietly this works. Wealth can intimidate, but secrets manipulate. They bend behavior without confrontation. They allow some people to survive scandals, avoid accountability, or influence outcomes without anyone realizing it. That's why after the Epstein exposure, you saw a noticeable shift. More attention to surveillance, private intelligence, digital monitoring, and careful vetting of associates. The ultra-rich weren't just protecting their assets anymore. They were protecting access to knowledge itself, which had become the real capital. The files showed that while everyone was shocked by the crimes, the people who really noticed were those who understood the mechanics behind them. They understood that in the world of influence, cash is temporary, but the right information can last forever, bending reality in ways money never could. Number 4, the illusion of invincibility was destroyed. For decades, extreme wealth carried with it an unspoken assumption: money equals immunity. The ultra-elite moved through the world believing that assets, connections, and carefully curated reputations could shield them from almost anything. The Epstein files shattered that belief. Suddenly, the untouchable was shown to be very touchable, and the illusion of invincibility that had cocooned them for years cracked in a very public way. The files revealed that no amount of influence, no private network, no legal team could guarantee permanent safety. Laws could be challenged, loopholes exploited, and money could fight investigations. But once evidence entered public view, control became tenuous. The exposure reminded the powerful that vulnerability isn't about morality. It's about perception. A single leaked document, a corroborated witness, or an overlooked connection could undo decades of carefully built armor. This realization triggered an urgent recalibration at the top. For the first time, many recognized that influence is conditional, fleeting, and fragile. Wealth might delay consequences, but it cannot indefinitely suppress public scrutiny or human curiosity. Reputation, once considered a side effect of power, suddenly became its core defense. Maintaining invincibility required constant attention, not just to law and finance, but to optics, narratives, and human psychology. The psychological impact on the elite was profound. People who had assumed their networks were impermeable realized that proximity to scandal could reach them despite careful planning. Friends, associates, and even long-trusted allies could become liabilities under pressure. The sense of invulnerability vanished, replaced with calculated caution and an almost obsessive awareness of every potential exposure. What made the change permanent wasn't fear of punishment. It was awareness that their image, influence, and access were all fragile. The files didn't just document wrongdoing, they rewrote the rules of survival at the highest levels. The ultra-rich began to treat perception as reality, and control over perception became more valuable than any asset. Once invincibility was shown to be an illusion, every subsequent move in elite circles became a measured calculation, a silent acknowledgement that the world could finally see them as human, fallible, and strategically vulnerable. Number 5, public trust became the most scarce resource. When the Epstein files surfaced, it wasn't just the individuals involved who were exposed, it was entire systems. Governments, media institutions, universities, and philanthropic organizations all found themselves under a microscope. People began noticing patterns of protection, silence, and complicity that had been invisible for years. What became clear was that public trust, once assumed to be almost limitless, was now fragile and exceptionally rare. The wealthy and powerful realized almost immediately that money and influence alone could no longer guarantee stability. You could own assets, control industries, and manipulate markets. But if public perception turned against you, all that power became precarious. Trust had always been a silent foundation for influence, but the files made it tangible. Suddenly, it was a resource you had to earn constantly, manage carefully, and protect fiercely. Every connection, every public statement, and every visible association now had to be calculated with an acute awareness of how it would affect perception. For the ultra-rich, the stakes were existential. Losing trust doesn't just hurt reputation. It reduces leverage. It turns allies into skeptics and opens the door to scrutiny that can't be bought off. People who had assumed that discretion and wealth were sufficient shields discovered that credibility, once damaged, is nearly impossible to restore. The public began to see not only what was done, but also who allowed it to happen, and that ripple extended far beyond the obvious players. The scarcity of trust forced a shift in strategy. Influence now depended on perception management, storytelling, and psychological insight. The elite studied patterns of belief, emotional responses, and collective attention, understanding that trust is a currency that cannot be forced, only cultivated. Every alliance, every philanthropic effort, and every public gesture became a negotiation with the public's willingness to believe. The files proved that power without trust is fragile, and influence without credibility is temporary. Once society began questioning institutions at a deep level, the game changed forever. For billionaires and leaders, surviving scandals became less about hiding facts and more about managing perception, regaining faith, and understanding that public trust is the most valuable and the most elusive resource of all. Number 6, image management turned into psychological warfare. After the Epstein files went public, it became obvious that reputation is not just fragile, it's a battlefield. For the ultra-wealthy, controlling their image shifted from a luxury to a necessity, and it didn't stay in the realm of public relations. It became psychological warfare. Every word, every silence, every social media post, and even the way they moved in public was analyzed, timed, and designed to shape perception before anyone else could. Influence wasn't just about appearing powerful anymore. It was about predicting how people would feel about that power and acting preemptively. The exposure taught a hard truth. Facts alone don't control the narrative. Emotion does. Anger spreads faster than logic. Suspicion lingers longer than denial. Billionaires and high-level figures began hiring teams of behavioral analysts, crisis strategists, and psychologists, not just to fix PR problems, but to anticipate emotional reactions and neutralize them before they could escalate. A casual misstep could spiral into a reputational wildfire, so every interaction became calculated, almost surgical in its intent. What's remarkable is how subtle it became. The goal wasn't obvious. It wasn't about shouting denials or making grand gestures. It was about directing attention without anyone noticing, framing context invisibly, and controlling emotional temperature so the public would perceive calm, strength, and inevitability. Timing, placement, and narrative sequencing became as critical as any legal maneuver or financial move. The wealthy learned that you can't just defend an image, you have to engineer perception at the cognitive level. This strategic sophistication is what makes the shift so profound. It's no longer just a matter of polishing an image. It's about understanding human psychology, predicting outrage cycles, and subtly shaping decisions and beliefs. Every press release, every interview, and every charitable act is scrutinized for its emotional impact. In this new reality, image management isn't cosmetic, it's combat. The Epstein files didn't just expose crimes, they revealed that influence is now fought in the realm of thought and feeling. For those who survived the exposure, mastering the psychology of perception became the ultimate weapon, turning reputation into a battlefield where victories are won long before the public even realizes there's a war. Number 7, power is no longer just vertical, it's digital. The Epstein files made one truth impossible to ignore. The old ways of controlling power no longer work. It used to be enough to hold influence through hierarchy, titles, and exclusive access. Control was vertical, top-down, tightly managed, and insulated. That illusion crumbled when digital exposure proved that information could travel sideways, unnoticed, and uncontrollably. A single leak could bypass layers of protection, reach millions, and reshape perception faster than any executive or lawyer could respond. The ultra-wealthy quickly realized that surviving in the modern era isn't about stacking authority in private offices. It's about understanding the digital ecosystem where attention moves. Platforms, algorithms, social networks, and even niche forums became battlegrounds. Once someone posts a connection, an allegation, or a document, it doesn't need mainstream approval to be impactful. It spreads, accumulates credibility through repetition, and alters perception in ways traditional power couldn't stop. Digital visibility became as important as any private meeting or political favor. This shift changed how the elite operate behind the scenes. Investments are no longer just financial, they are strategic in the realm of information control. Tech teams, monitoring systems, and online behavior analysts became essential. Every post, comment, or even absence online is examined for its potential ripple effect. Controlling platforms, shaping narratives, and managing digital footprints became as critical as legal defense. In many cases, it is the invisible digital work that protects more than money, influence, or secrecy ever could. What makes this transformation so profound is its permanence. Digital memory is relentless. Once information enters the network, it can't truly be erased. The files expose that past behaviors, associations, and communications could be tracked, indexed, and resurfaced indefinitely. For the wealthy, this meant that survival depends less on what you do today and more on understanding how everything you've ever done can be perceived, dissected, and weaponized tomorrow. The old rules of power, vertical control, exclusive access, and elite circles are no longer sufficient. Influence now exists in the horizontal spread of information, in networks of awareness, and in perception that can move faster than any strategy. The Epstein files didn't just expose crimes, they exposed a new reality. The battlefield of power is digital, and if you don't master it, invincibility is impossible. Number 8. Silence became suspicious. Before the Epstein files went public, silence was a shield. The ultra-wealthy could choose when to speak, what to reveal, and who to respond to, and the world assumed discretion was wisdom. Quietness suggested stability, control, and even innocence. After the exposure, that assumption no longer held. Silence became a signal, a provocation, and in many cases, a liability. Not saying anything didn't protect anymore. It raised eyebrows, created speculation, and invited narratives to form without consent. The files proved that absence of response could be louder than words. When powerful people went quiet, it was no longer read as strategy, it was read as calculation under pressure. People began noticing timing, patterns of omission, and selective visibility. Suddenly, the public, media, and even peers started reading between the lines with much more scrutiny. What wasn't said became as meaningful as what was. and that meant silence had to be handled with the same care as public statements. This shifted behavior at the highest levels. Billionaires, politicians, and other elites realized that controlling perception meant managing silence as deliberately as speech. Every unexplained absence, every non-comment, every delayed response could be interpreted as guilt, collusion, or strategic retreat. Teams of advisors, psychologists, and communication specialists began mapping not only what to say, but when to say it, how long to remain silent, and how to craft pauses to signal exactly the right emotion. Silence transformed from a defensive posture into an instrument of influence, but only when wielded with expert precision. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Silence without strategy invited assumptions, and assumptions could quickly spread into widespread belief. What once allowed powerful people to appear untouchable now risked undoing them entirely if mishandled. Perception became a minefield where a single quiet moment could spark suspicion strong enough to erode years of influence. The Epstein files proved a harsh truth. In the modern age, people don't just watch what the powerful do. They watch what they don't do. Every pause, every absence, every unspoken word carries weight. Silence is no longer a safe space. It is a statement in itself, one that must be mastered, calculated, and controlled, or it will speak for you in ways you cannot contain. Number 9, the public discovered pattern recognition. The Epstein files didn't just shock the world because of what they revealed. They shocked it because they revealed patterns. Names repeated, connections overlapped, meetings coincided, and behaviors echoed across industries and social circles. People began noticing these patterns, quietly at first, and then more openly. Once the public started connecting the dots, a subtle but profound shift occurred. Ordinary observers realized they could see the framework that power had been hiding behind for decades. Pattern recognition changed everything because it turned random outrage into informed awareness. People weren't just reacting to individual stories or names. They were seeing networks of influence, protection, and complicity. Every association told a story, and the story wasn't flattering. The realization spread that power doesn't operate in isolation. It operates in systems, carefully engineered and maintained, and that system could be understood if you paid attention. That knowledge transformed passive spectators into active analysts, able to track behaviors, anticipate moves, and notice inconsistencies that had once gone unquestioned. For the ultra-wealthy, this awakening was alarming. Influence had thrived in secrecy, in the gaps between public perception and private reality. Once pattern recognition went public, those gaps shrank. Ordinary people could now predict behavior, notice repeated tactics, and identify who benefited from silence, protection, or selective exposure. That made control much harder to maintain. The audience was no longer blind. It was discerning, calculating, and increasingly skeptical. This shift forced the elite to adapt. Relationships, communications, and public appearances had to be even more carefully managed. The repetition that once reinforced trust and influence now invited scrutiny. Every move, every connection, every decision could be dissected, mapped, and understood. In essence, the files taught the public to read the blueprint of power, making traditional influence strategies far less effective. The real impact of pattern recognition is psychological. It's not just knowledge, it's empowerment. Once people start noticing structures, connections, and behaviors, they stop being passive consumers of information and become interpreters of reality. And for those who have long relied on secrecy and selective exposure, that is profoundly destabilizing. The Epstein files didn't just expose crimes. They exposed a system, and once systems are visible, they can no longer operate the same way. Number 10, philanthropy lost its shield. For decades, charity was more than generosity. It was armor. Billionaires and public figures could donate millions, fund causes, and build foundations, and the world would see them as virtuous, untouchable, and morally untarnished. Giving became a shield, a way to protect reputation from scrutiny. After the Epstein files, that illusion crumbled. Philanthropy no longer guarantees credibility, and the elite realized that optics alone can't hide complicity or questionable behavior. The exposure made one thing clear: actions outside of giving carry more weight than the acts of giving themselves. Public perception shifted, and generosity without transparency no longer sufficed. Large donations could still impress, but they no longer excused patterns of access, silence, or exploitation. The files revealed that the people behind the donations were as human, as flawed, and as strategic as anyone else, and sometimes far more calculated. The public began asking not just what was being funded, but who was funding it, why, and what narrative it served. This realization triggered a major recalibration. Billionaires and institutions began treating philanthropy less like a moral statement and more like a tool that required precision. Giving had to align not only with personal or corporate branding, but with narrative consistency, public expectations, and emotional resonance. Every act of charity became a form of communication, an attempt to restore trust and manage perception rather than a simple act of kindness. The files also revealed the fragility of moral shields. When wrongdoing surfaces, past generosity doesn't erase it. It amplifies scrutiny. People start asking uncomfortable questions. Was the giving genuine or was it strategic? Did it serve the public or did it serve the reputation of the giver? Those questions are impossible to fully control, and they showed the elite that no amount of financial generosity can replace authentic credibility. In the wake of the exposure, philanthropy is no longer a protective cloak. It's a statement that must be crafted carefully, managed intentionally, and measured against public perception. The Epstein files proved that moral influence can't be bought. It can only be earned. And once public trust erodes, even the most generous giving cannot restore it fully. Number 11, loyalty within elite circles became conditional. The Epstein files exposed something few wanted to admit. In elite circles, loyalty is never absolute. It's transactional, fragile, and highly conditional. For years, there was an unspoken assumption that connections built through wealth, power, and influence were unshakable. Friends, colleagues, and allies were trusted implicitly because survival depended on unity. The files dismantled that illusion. Once scandal surfaces, self-preservation outweighs allegiance, and relationships that seemed solid can fracture in an instant. The exposure revealed the mechanics of survival at the highest levels. When the pressure comes from public scrutiny, legal risk, or media attention, alliances are tested. Those who once operated as a network of mutual protection suddenly start calculating what benefits them, what risks they face, and who could jeopardize their position. Loyalty is no longer blind. It's a negotiation that depends on timing, visibility, and perceived advantage. Even long-standing relationships are evaluated constantly, with trust measured in contingencies rather than emotions. For the ultra-wealthy, this realization was destabilizing. Knowing that alliances are conditional changes behavior, strategies shift from collective protection to individual survival. Conversations, meetings, and even private interactions are now filtered through layers of risk assessment. Every word, every promise, every gesture is weighed for its potential leverage or liability. People learn to hedge relationships, to maintain distance, and to prepare for shifts in allegiance that might arrive suddenly and without warning. The files also revealed a harsher truth. Conditional loyalty doesn't just protect individuals. It can be weaponized. Information, favors, or access can be used to test alliances, extract compliance, or anticipate betrayal. Understanding who will hold, who will fold, and who will defect becomes as important as wealth or influence itself. In the aftermath, elite circles became a chessboard. Every connection, every association, every alliance is strategic, with loyalty existing only as long as it serves the self-interest of the players involved. The Epstein files didn't just expose crimes, they exposed the fragility of trust at the top, showing that in the world of extreme influence, relationships are conditional, calculated, and never guaranteed. Number 12, wealth doesn't erase digital memory. The Epstein files made one thing painfully clear: no amount of money can delete history. For decades, the ultra-wealthy operated under the assumption that wealth could erase mistakes, shield reputations, and control narratives. Private investigators, legal teams, and discretion were thought to be enough to keep past actions buried. The exposure shattered that notion entirely. Digital records, archived communications, and investigative documentation proved that once something exists, it never truly disappears. Wealth can delay exposure, but it cannot undo permanence. Digital memory is relentless. Every email, message, transaction, photograph, and digital trace becomes part of a permanent record. The files revealed that even small details overlooked by those in power can resurface years later with immense consequences. What once seemed insignificant, a name, a date, a connection, can be amplified, cross-referenced, and weaponized in ways no one could have anticipated. The wealthy learned that survival isn't just about controlling current perception. It's about managing an indelible past that will always be accessible to someone paying attention. This understanding transformed strategies at the highest level. Investments in digital security, surveillance, and data monitoring became as critical as investments in legal teams or public relations. The elite realized that it's not enough to hide wrongdoing. They must anticipate what traces might remain and how those traces could influence perception, reputation, and influence years down the line. The permanence of digital memory creates a new kind of vulnerability, one that cannot be bribed, litigated away, or physically erased. The files also forced a reckoning with transparency. Once information leaks into the digital ecosystem, attempts to erase or rewrite it often worsen the situation, drawing more attention and scrutiny. The ultra-wealthy learned that long-term survival depends on anticipating exposure, managing digital footprints, and understanding that every action is recorded, remembered, and potentially reconstructed. The Epstein files taught an unforgettable lesson. Wealth buys many things, but it cannot erase history. Digital memory endures, connects the dots, and exposes patterns. In a world where everything leaves a trace, even the most protected, powerful, and wealthy are never truly untouchable. Permanence has become the new reality of influence. Number 13, the masses became harder to predict. The Epstein files revealed a truth that unsettled the powerful in a way money couldn't fix. The public doesn't behave like a predictable machine. Outrage isn't linear, curiosity isn't uniform, and attention doesn't follow rules. Before the exposure, the elite operated with confidence, assuming that public opinion could be managed through influence, media control, or selective messaging. The files proved that those assumptions no longer hold. People react emotionally, rapidly, and often in ways that no amount of preparation can fully anticipate. For billionaires and high-level players, this unpredictability was both shocking and dangerous. The patterns they relied on, timing of narratives, carefully curated responses, controlled visibility, suddenly became less reliable. Ordinary observers could interpret events differently, connect unrelated dots, and even amplify minor revelations into major public sentiment shifts. The audience had leveled up. Once people began analyzing behavior, spotting inconsistencies, and forming independent conclusions, the old methods of influence began to crumble. This shift forced a profound change in strategy. The wealthy started investing in behavioral modeling, social monitoring, and psychological analysis to anticipate public reaction. They studied anger cycles, attention spans, viral trends, and emotional tipping points with precision. What used to be considered overreaction was now data, a signal to be interpreted and incorporated into strategy. The unpredictable nature of collective behavior demanded a level of preparation that went beyond traditional PR or legal defenses. The unpredictability also revealed a deeper vulnerability. Influence could no longer rely solely on authority, wealth, or reputation. It had to account for curiosity, skepticism, and independent thought. Once the masses became aware of systemic corruption or hidden patterns of power, their reactions couldn't be fully controlled, only guided, deflected, or mitigated. The exposure demonstrated that power is fragile, not just when it is legally challenged, but when it is psychologically observed. The Epstein files taught the elite a difficult lesson. The collective mind cannot be fully predicted or tamed. In a world where people connect information, recognize patterns, and form their own conclusions, influence requires subtlety, constant adaptation, and an understanding that no strategy can fully account for the unpredictable energy of the public. Control is no longer guaranteed, perception is volatile, and survival depends on mastering the art of navigating unpredictability. Number 14, the true shift was psychological, not legal. The Epstein files changed the world in a way that the courtroom never could. Lawsuits, arrests, and trials are temporary spectacles, but the files created a permanent shift in awareness. The most significant impact wasn't who went to jail or who avoided it. It was how society began to see power itself. People stopped assuming that wealth equals morality and that shift in collective perception is irreversible. The files didn't just expose crimes. They exposed a mindset, a network, and a system of influence that had been operating above scrutiny for decades. For the elite, this psychological awakening was terrifying. Money, lawyers, and private security can't defend against a change in collective consciousness. Once the public begins to question, analyze, and connect the dots, the rules of survival shift. Influence no longer relies solely on visibility or control of resources. It relies on trust, perception, and the belief of those watching. That belief cannot be bought back once it is lost. The files showed that even the most insulated figures are vulnerable when society starts thinking critically instead of following blindly. This shift forced the ultra-wealthy to adapt at a deep level. The focus moved from legal loopholes to psychological strategy, from hiding mistakes to managing perception, from controlling narratives superficially to anticipating emotional responses at scale. The public's mental engagement became the real battlefield. Influence is now about predicting thought patterns, controlling attention, and shaping belief without being overt. The files revealed that every action, omission, and connection could be interpreted, misinterpreted, or weaponized in the court of public opinion. The lasting lesson is clear. Legal outcomes are fleeting, but awareness is permanent. Once people understand the mechanisms behind power, nothing can fully restore the old assumptions. The Epstein files didn't just document crimes, they altered the collective psyche, making society more vigilant, more skeptical, and more analytical. That psychological shift is what truly unsettled the elite. No court, no settlement, and no public statement can undo the awakening. The files proved that the human mind, once engaged and aware, cannot be silenced, and that realization has forever changed the rules of influence, control, and survival at the highest levels of wealth and power. The Epstein files didn't just expose hidden crimes, they exposed the fragile architecture of power itself. What once seemed untouchable, untouchably wealthy, and untouchably influential was revealed to be human, fallible, and strategically vulnerable. We saw that access is far more revealing than actions, that money can't erase digital memory, and that secrets, once weaponized, hold more power than cash ever could. The files shifted the focus from legality to psychology, from superficial control to the subtleties of perception, emotion, and public consciousness. The ultra-wealthy learned, often the hard way, that survival depends not just on wealth, influence, or loyalty, but on understanding the human mind, anticipating public reaction, and navigating an audience that is smarter, more observant, and less forgiving than ever before. The fallout was more than reputational damage. It was a complete recalibration of how power operates. Silence became dangerous, loyalty became conditional, and philanthropy could no longer shield mistakes. Digital reality replaced old hierarchies, perception replaced influence, and awareness replaced blind obedience. The files proved that the real battlefield isn't in courts, boardrooms, or private planes. It's in the collective psyche of society. Once the mind of the public awakens to patterns, connections, and hidden networks, no legal maneuver can fully contain the consequences. The elite were forced to recognize a truth many had ignored. In a world where perception is permanent, influence is fragile, and awareness is unstoppable, survival is no longer guaranteed, and control is no longer absolute. This is the era of psychological power, where understanding the human mind has become the ultimate form of influence, and where the audience can no longer be underestimated. The Epstein files were a wake-up call, not just about corruption or crime, but about the irreversible shift in collective consciousness. They proved that true power lies in anticipating thought, managing perception, and respecting the intelligence of the people. If this breakdown gave you clarity, insight, or even just a deeper understanding of how influence, wealth, and human behavior intersect, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss this kind of analysis. Like this video, if it opened your eyes, share it with someone who needs to see the bigger picture, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Let's continue this conversation together. Your engagement keeps this exploration alive, and it helps more people understand the forces shaping the world around us. Stay awake, chosen ones.